German U-boats hunted American ships like wolves until U.S. destroyers turned the hunters into prey. In 1941 to 1943, German Admiral Karl Donitz called it the happy time. His U-boats prowled American coastal waters, sinking merchant ships within sight of beaches where families vacationed. In the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank over 600 Allied ships off the American coast, more tonnage lost than at Pearl Harbor. Americans watched ships burn on the horizon, bodies washed up on tourist beaches. Donitz boasted his wolf packs would starve Britain into surrender. Then American destroyer captains learned to hunt submarines. New technology turned invisible U-boats into sitting ducks. By 1943, German submariners called the Atlantic the Valley of Death. The hunters had become the hunted.
January 12, 1942. Atlantic Ocean, 60 miles off New York City. Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hartigan stood on the conning tower of U-123, watching through his binoculars as another American merchant ship burned against the night sky. The third kill in 2 days. The ship, the tanker SS Normandy, had never seen them coming. "How many ships can we see burning from here?" asked his first officer, Horst von Schroeter. Hartigan counted the orange glows on the horizon. 5, maybe 6, and we put 3 of them there. Von Schroeter laughed. "The Americans still haven't figured out they're at war. No escorts, no convoys, ships sailing alone with navigation lights on, broadcasting their positions by radio. It's like shooting fish in a barrel." He wasn't wrong. 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the United States had done almost nothing to protect merchant shipping along its own coast. Ships sailed independently, often silhouetted against brightly lit coastal cities that refused to dim their lights. German U-boats could surface at night, shoot torpedoes at targets they could see clearly, then dive and escape before anyone knew what happened. Hartigan raised his binoculars again, scanning the horizon. "There, another target. Looks like a tanker. Full loaded by how low she's sitting in the water." U-123 altered course, approaching the target at periscope depth. At 0300 hours, Hartigan fired 2 torpedoes. Both hit. The tanker, SS Coimbra, exploded, her cargo of heating oil turning her into a floating inferno, visible for miles. "Log it," Hartigan ordered. "Tanker, approximately 7,000 tons, sunk with all hands." What Hartigan didn't log was that the explosion was visible from the beaches of Long Island, where horrified Americans watched one of their ships die, or that bodies and debris would wash ashore for days, or that this was just the beginning of the slaughter. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding Germany's U-boat fleet from his headquarters in France, called it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. His submarines were operating with near impunity off the American coast, sinking more ships than at any other time in the war. In the first 6 months of 1942, German U-boats sank over 600 Allied ships in American waters. More than 3 million tons of shipping destroyed, more tonnage than was lost at Pearl Harbor. The oil slicks were so extensive they fouled beaches from Florida to Maine. Bodies washed up on tourist beaches. Survivors told horror stories of burning ships and desperate hours in lifeboats. And America seemed helpless to stop it. This is the story of how German U-boats nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic by bringing war to America's doorstep, and how American destroyer captains, using new technology and old-fashioned courage, turned the Atlantic from a German hunting ground into a graveyard for submarines.
Donitz called the operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat. The plan was simple and devastating. Send U-boats to American coastal waters where ships sailed unprotected and sink everything they could find. The operation began on January 11, 1942, with just 5 U-boats. 5. That's all it took to bring chaos to American shipping. The U-boats operated with shocking freedom. They surfaced at night to attack, knowing American ships had no escorts, no air cover, minimal defensive armament. Some U-boat commanders became so confident they attacked in daylight, surfacing to use their deck guns to save torpedoes. Captain Lieutenant Hardigan's U-123 patrolled off New York Harbor. In 2 weeks, he sank 9 ships, totaling over 50,000 tons. He grew so brazen, he surfaced within sight of Coney Island, photographing the beach and amusement park with his periscope camera. "We could hear the music from the shore," Hardigan later recalled. "See the lights from the city, the Ferris wheel turning, and merchant ships sailing past us with all their lights on, like it was peacetime. It was surreal." The problem was that America was unprepared for submarine warfare. The Navy had few escort vessels available. Most were in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. Merchant ships had no training in anti-submarine tactics. Coastal cities refused to dim their lights, worried about tourism and morale, making ships perfect silhouettes for U-boat commanders. Worse, there was no convoy system. Ships sailed independently, each one a lone target. U-boats could position themselves along known shipping routes and pick off vessels one by one. The slaughter was systematic and horrifying. Tankers were priority targets. Their cargo of oil or gasoline made them spectacular kills. When hit, they often exploded, creating fireballs visible for miles. Survival rates for tanker crews were appalling. Many burned to death. Others drowned in oil-fouled water. Some made it to lifeboats only to watch their shipmates die. Captain Henry Stevenson survived the sinking of SS Pan, Massachusetts, off Cape Hatteras. His account, given to Coast Guard investigators, captured the terror. "We never saw the submarine, just a massive explosion amidships. The ship broke in two. Oil everywhere, burning on the water. Men were screaming, trying to swim through burning oil. I got into a lifeboat with 8 others. We watched our ship sink, watched the fire spread across the ocean. 3 men in the water were burned alive. We could hear them screaming but couldn't reach them. The submarine never surfaced. We didn't know if it was still there watching us die."
The carnage off America's coast wasn't just due to German skill. It was due to American incompetence and stubbornness. British authorities, who'd been fighting U-boats since 1939, offered advice. Institute convoys immediately, dim coastal lights, organize air patrols, deploy escort vessels. The British knew what worked. They'd learned through bitter experience. American authorities largely ignored them. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, resented British interference and believed American methods would work better. They didn't. Coastal cities refused to dim their lights. Tourism concerns trumped security. Miami's mayor argued that dimming lights would hurt the hotel industry. Atlantic City's Chamber of Commerce protested that beach visitors needed lighting. New York's entertainment district stayed brilliantly lit. The result? Ships sailing past brightly lit cities were perfectly silhouetted against the glow. U-boat commanders couldn't believe their luck. They had perfect visibility of targets that had no idea they were being hunted. Korvettenkapitan Werner Hartenstein, commanding U-156, described it in his war diary. "American cities light up the sky like Christmas. Ships pass in front of this backdrop like targets in a shooting gallery. We don't even need our periscopes. Surface observation is sufficient. The Americans are making our job easier than we ever dreamed possible." The lack of convoys was equally inexcusable. The British had proven convoys worked. Grouping ships together with escorts made them harder to attack and easier to defend. But America lacked escort vessels and didn't want to waste time organizing convoys. So ships continued sailing independently, each one alone, each one vulnerable, each one another statistic in the growing death toll. By March 1942, ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. If the rate continued, Britain would run out of food and supplies by year end. The U-boats were winning. Donitz's tactical innovation was the Rudel tactic, wolf pack tactics. Instead of submarines hunting alone, they operated in groups of 8 to 20 U-boats, coordinated by radio from headquarters in France. The tactic was brutally effective. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it would radio the position to headquarters. Donitz would direct other U-boats in the area to converge. Then they'd attack simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts and creating chaos. Convoy SC-42 in September 1941 demonstrated the Wolfpack's devastating potential. 16 merchant ships sunk in 3 days. The escorts couldn't defend against attacks from every direction simultaneously. While they chased one U-boat, others attacked from different angles. The psychological impact was enormous. Merchant sailors knew that once a Wolfpack found their convoy, the next 24 to 48 hours would be hell. Night attacks were worst. Torpedoes coming from multiple directions, ships exploding, burning oil on water. Survivors in lifeboats watching the carnage continue. Captain James Bissett, commanding a merchant ship in multiple convoys, described Wolfpack attacks. You'd see torpedoes in the water, white trails coming from different directions, ships exploding on both sides of the convoy, escorts racing around, dropping depth charges, radio calls for help, flares lighting up the night. And through it all, you knew the U-boats were out there, invisible, reloading torpedoes, preparing to attack again. The waiting between attacks was almost worse than the attacks themselves. By mid-1942, Donitz had nearly 400 operational U-boats. He was building them faster than the Allies could sink them. He calculated that if he could maintain a sinking rate of 700,000 tons per month, Britain would be forced to surrender by late 1943. The mathematics were on Germany's side, and American coastal waters provided the perfect hunting ground to reach those numbers.
The tide began turning in 1943 with new technology that made U-boats vulnerable. Radar was the first game changer. Early war radar couldn't detect submarines effectively, but by 1943, centimetric radar sets could spot a submarine's conning tower at night from miles away. U-boats that had operated with near immunity on the surface now faced detection the moment they surfaced. Sonar, called ASDIC by the British, improved dramatically. Better equipment could detect submarines at greater ranges and track them more accurately. The blind nature of anti-submarine warfare was becoming less blind. But the real revolution was the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar. Traditional depth charges were dropped off the stern, forcing escorts to pass over the submarine's location and lose sonar contact. Hedgehogs fired 24 small bombs forward in a circular pattern, allowing escorts to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack. More importantly, Hedgehog bombs only exploded on contact with the submarine. Traditional depth charges exploded at preset depths, creating huge underwater explosions that made it impossible to tell if you'd hit the submarine. With Hedgehogs, if you heard an explosion, meaning you hit, or you heard nothing and needed to attack again. It was devastatingly effective once we learned to use it properly.
America's organizational response was the Hunter-Killer Group, dedicated anti-submarine task forces built around escort carriers with destroyer escorts. Instead of waiting for U-boats to attack convoys, these groups actively hunted submarines. The escort carriers' aircraft provided air cover and spotted submarines from above. Destroyer escorts would then attack with depth charges and Hedgehogs. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, pioneered aggressive hunter-killer tactics. His group didn't just defend, they hunted. When they detected a U-boat, they pursued relentlessly until they destroyed it. Gallery's philosophy was simple. The best defense is a good offense. Don't wait for U-boats to attack our convoys. Find them first and kill them. His tactics worked spectacularly. On June 4, 1944, Gallery's group accomplished something unprecedented. They captured U-505 intact. After damaging the submarine with depth charges, boarding parties seized it before the crew could scuttle it. It was the first enemy warship captured by the U.S. Navy since 1815. The captured U-boat yielded intelligence bonanzas, codebooks, an Enigma machine, operational documents. But more importantly, it proved that American hunter-killer groups had become deadly threats to U-boats.
May 1943 was the turning point. That month, the Allies sank 43 German U-boats, more in 1 month than in the previous 6 months combined. Dönitz was shocked. His casualty reports showed submarine losses exceeding replacement rates for the first time. His wolf packs were being decimated. Crews that had operated with confidence were now terrified. The happy time was over. The Atlantic had become the valley of death for U-boat crews. The statistics told a brutal story. In 1942, a U-boat crew had about a 70% chance of surviving their first patrol. By mid-1943, survival odds had dropped below 50%. By 1944, over 75% of U-boat crews were being killed. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner, one of the few U-boat commanders who survived the war, described the change. In 1942, we hunted the convoys. By 1943, they were hunting us. Every time we surfaced, aircraft appeared within minutes. Every convoy had more escorts than merchant ships. The destroyers had new weapons that were terrifyingly accurate. We went from hunters to hunted. The Atlantic became our grave. German U-boat crews developed a grim fatalism. They knew the odds. Most wouldn't survive their first few patrols. Some crews mutinied rather than sail. Others went to sea knowing they were already dead men. American destroyer captains became the elite submarine killers. Men like Commander Frederick Moosebrugger, Captain Buckley, and dozens of others who mastered the art of hunting U-boats. These weren't desk officers. They were warriors who understood that killing submarines required skill, patience, and aggression. They trained their crews relentlessly, practiced sonar tracking, rehearsed depth charge patterns, studied U-boat tactics. Commander Howard Oram, commanding USS Champlain, sank 3 U-boats in 1944. His philosophy? Submarines are deadly when they have the initiative. Take that away, keep them defensive, force them to react to us instead of acting against convoys, and they become vulnerable. Our job is to make every U-boat captain too worried about survival to focus on attacking. The relationship between sonar operators and commanders was critical. Sonar ops would listen for hours, tracking subtle sounds that indicated a submarine. Commanders had to interpret those reports and decide when and how to attack. Sonarman First Class William Thompson, serving on USS Bory, described tracking U-boats. You'd listen for hours through headphones, background noise, waves, ship screws, biologics. Then you'd hear it, a rhythmic sound. Diesel engines, maybe, or electric motors. You'd track it, determine bearing and range, pass it to the captain. Sometimes you'd lose contact, then regain it. Sometimes it disappeared completely. You never knew if you'd actually heard a submarine or were chasing false contacts. But when depth charges went off and oil and debris came up, you knew you'd been right.
The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't one-sided. American destroyers and merchant ships continued taking casualties throughout the war. USS Reuben James was sunk by U-552 in October 1941, before America even entered the war. The first U.S. warship sunk. 115 men died. USS Jacob Jones was sunk by U-578 in February 1942 off New Jersey. 138 killed. USS Leopold was sunk by U-255 in March 1944. 171 lost. Each sinking was a tragedy. Each destroyer that went down took experienced crews with it. And merchant sailors continued dying throughout the war. Over 9,000 American merchant mariners were killed. one of the highest casualty rates of any service. The psychological toll was enormous. Destroyer crews knew that if a U-boat got a torpedo off first, they might not survive. Merchant sailors knew every voyage could be their last. The Atlantic was cold. Survival time in the water measured in minutes during winter. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Sarsfield, surviving the sinking of USS Buck, described the experience. "We were hit by 2 torpedoes. The ship broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. I was blown off the bridge by the second explosion. Found myself in the water in darkness, oil everywhere, men screaming. Some were on fire from burning oil, others were drowning. We tried to help each other, but the cold was overwhelming. Within 20 minutes, men started dying from hypothermia. By the time rescue arrived 2 hours later, half of us were gone."
By 1944, U-boat crews knew they were sailing to their deaths. German submariners had the highest casualty rate of any German military service, 75% killed. The experience of being depth-charged was psychological torture, unable to see attackers, unable to fight back, just waiting in darkness while explosions shook the submarine, water leaking through cracked seals, light bulbs shattering, men praying, vomiting from fear, knowing the next explosion might crush the hull. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner survived 200 days in U-boats. His memoir describes depth-charge attacks. Quote, "The destroyer above would ping with sonar. We could hear it through the hull, a metallic ringing getting faster as they closed in. Then the charges would start falling. Explosions everywhere. The submarine would shake violently, lights would flicker and die, pipes would burst, men would scream prayers. We'd go deeper, trying to escape, but the explosions followed us. Sometimes attacks lasted hours. Men would lose control, sobbing, begging to surface and surrender. The captain would threaten to shoot anyone who panicked. We'd just sit in darkness, breathing recycled air, waiting to die." The final statistics of the Battle of the Atlantic are staggering. 783 U-boats destroyed, 28,000 German submariners killed, 75% of all U-boat personnel, 175 Allied warships sunk by U-boats, 3,500 merchant ships sunk, 36,000 Allied merchant sailors killed. But by 1945, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. U-boats that once hunted with impunity were now targets. The hunters had become the hunted. By 1944, U-boat crews knew they were sailing to their deaths. German submariners had the highest casualty rate of any German military service, 75% killed. The experience of being depth-charged was psychological torture, unable to see attackers, unable to fight back, just waiting in darkness while explosions shook the submarine, water leaking through cracked seals, light bulbs shattering, men praying, vomiting from fear, knowing the next explosion might crush the hull. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner survived 200 days in U-boats. His memoir describes depth-charge attacks. Quote, "The destroyer above would ping with sonar. We could hear it through the hull, a metallic ringing getting faster as they closed in. Then the charges would start falling. Explosions everywhere. The submarine would shake violently, lights would flicker and die, pipes would burst, men would scream prayers. We'd go deeper, trying to escape, but the explosions followed us. Sometimes attacks lasted hours. Men would lose control, sobbing, begging to surface and surrender. The captain would threaten to shoot anyone who panicked. We'd just sit in darkness, breathing recycled air, waiting to die." The final statistics of the Battle of the Atlantic are staggering. 783 U-boats destroyed, 28,000 German submariners killed, 75% of all U-boat personnel, 175 Allied warships sunk by U-boats, 3,500 merchant ships sunk, 36,000 Allied merchant sailors killed. But by 1945, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. U-boats that once hunted with impunity were now targets. The hunters had become the hunted.
In 1944, Germany introduced the schnorkel,
a breathing tube that allowed U-boats to run diesel engines while submerged, eliminating the need to surface at night. Theoretically, this should have made U-boats much harder to detect. No surfacing meant no radar detection. But in practice, schnorkels had serious problems. They were slow. U-boats could only make 6 knots while snorkeling versus 17 knots on the surface. They were uncomfortable. The diesel engine suction would create pressure changes that caused severe ear pain. They were unreliable. Waves would flood the schnorkel, causing the diesel to suck air from inside the submarine, potentially suffocating the crew. Most importantly, schnorkels came too late. By 1944, Allied anti-submarine forces were so effective that even improved U-boats couldn't operate successfully. The final German submarine innovations, Type 21 U-boats with revolutionary streamlined hulls and massive battery capacity, were even more impressive, but came even later. Only 4 saw combat service before the war ended. Far too few to change the outcome.
By early 1945, U-boat operations were suicidal. They still sailed because orders demanded it, but everyone knew the war was lost. U-boats continued attacking until Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. The last ship sunk was SS Avondale Park on May 7th, one day before the war ended. Pointless deaths in a lost cause. When Germany surrendered, 156 U-boats were at sea. Donitz ordered them to surface, hoist black flags, and proceed to Allied ports for internment. The once feared wolf packs limped into harbors as defeated enemies. Commander Peter Teddy Creamer, one of Germany's successful U-boat aces, described the surrender. "We surfaced for the last time, raised the black surrender flag, and sailed into a British port. Allied warships surrounded us, the same destroyers that had hunted us, that had killed so many of our comrades. We stood on deck as defeated men, knowing we'd lost. The Atlantic had beaten us." Allied authorities organized Operation Deadlight, the systematic scuttling of captured U-boats. 116 submarines were towed to deep water off Ireland and sunk by gunfire or torpedoes. The Germans were forced to watch their submarines destroyed. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted from September 1939 to May 1945, nearly 6 years of continuous combat, the longest battle of World War II. Final casualties: 28,000 German U-boat crew killed, 75% casualty rate. 36,000 Allied merchant sailors killed, 30,000 Royal Navy sailors killed, thousands of American naval personnel killed, over 3,500 merchant ships sunk, totaling 14.5 million tons. Tens of thousands of civilians drowned when passenger ships were sunk. Cities went hungry when food convoys were destroyed. But the Allies won. Britain never starved. The convoys kept running. American industry kept producing. And by 1945, the Atlantic was an Allied lake. For U-boat crews, the statistics were apocalyptic. Of 40,000 men who served in U-boats, 30,000 never came home, a 75% death rate. No other military service in any nation suffered casualties that high. Young men who joined the U-boat service, dreaming of glory, found only death in cold Atlantic waters. The romance of submarine warfare lasted about as long as their first depth charge attack. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that wars are won by industrial capacity and technological innovation, as much as by courage. Germany's U-boats were well-designed and well-crewed. German submariners were brave, skilled, and determined. But they couldn't overcome Allied advantages in numbers, technology, and intelligence. The battle also demonstrated the vital importance of merchant sailors. Without them, Britain would have starved. Without their courage in sailing through U-boat-infested waters,
The war couldn't have been won. Yet merchant mariners received far less recognition than combat servicemen. For American destroyer crews who hunted U-boats, the Atlantic remained a haunting memory. They'd faced an enemy they usually couldn't see, fighting a war of sonar pings and depth charge patterns. When they won, often the only evidence was oil and debris floating to the surface. Commander Howard Gilmore, who commanded multiple destroyers in anti-submarine operations, later reflected, "We sent thousands of German submariners to the bottom, young men most of them. They were the enemy, and we killed them without hesitation. But I never forgot they were men doing their duty, just like us. The Atlantic bottom is their grave. We put them there. It was necessary, but it was never something to celebrate." The Battle of the Atlantic changed naval warfare forever. It proved submarines were deadly, but vulnerable. It showed that anti-submarine warfare required specialized ships, tactics, and technology. Modern navies still study the Atlantic campaign, learning lessons written in the blood of 70,000 dead sailors. When Admiral Dönitz was asked after the war if he'd do anything differently, his answer was simple: build twice as many U-boats, and build them faster. We had the tactics, we had the crews, we just didn't have enough submarines to overcome Allied production and technology. Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic in shipyards and factories, not at sea. He was right. German U-boats hunted American ships like wolves in 1942. By 1943, American destroyers had turned the hunters into prey. The Atlantic became a graveyard for U-boats. Over 28,000 German submariners died in that graveyard. They sailed in submarines they called iron coffins, hunting convoys through waters patrolled by destroyers with technology that made U-boats visible, vulnerable, and ultimately doomed. The happy time lasted less than a year. The Valley of Death lasted 3 more years until Germany's surrender. In the end, technology, production, and determination defeated undersea warfare's greatest practitioners. American destroyer captains, using radar,